All right, everyone, ready for this? Today we are going deep into leases and licenses in India.
Ooh, sounds exciting.
Well, it can be a little dry, but it's actually really important, especially if you're ever thinking about renting a place or maybe you're letting somebody use your property.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes up more than you think.
Yeah, it does. So we're going to try to make this fun and interesting.
Yes.
So to guide us through this legal landscape, we're going to be using excerpts from a presentation by Poonam Todi, who is a civil judge in India, and she knows her stuff.
Yeah.
So by the end of this, you're going to be a pro at leases and licenses.
No more getting tricked by those tricky landlords.
That's right. All right, so let's start with the fundamentals. What is a lease in India? How do we define that?
Okay. Well, legally speaking, a lease is defined in the Transfer of Property Act's Section 105.
Okay.
And basically it comes down to you're transferring the right to enjoy a property
Okay.
for a specific amount of time. So it's kind of like having a slice of ownership for a little while.
Okay, a slice of ownership.
Yeah.
So how does that differ then from a license?
So a license is more about permission.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually defined in the Indian Easements Act, Section 52.
Got it.
And it's the right to do something specific on someone else's property,
Okay.
but you don't get any ownership rights.
Okay, so with a lease, it's like I'm an owner for a while,
Hmm.
and with a license, I'm just allowed to kind of be there or do something.
Right.
It's like renting an apartment versus buying a ticket to a cricket match.
That's such a good example. Yeah.
I mean, that is that kind of the distinction we're talking about here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the apartment, you're going to get a lease that gives you certain rights
Right.
and control over that property for the time that you're renting it.
Uh-huh.
Whereas a cricket match ticket, that's just a license.
Yeah.
It's saying, okay, you can come into the stadium and watch the match,
Right.
but you don't get any ownership.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned that with a lease, you get certain rights and control over the property. What are some of those key differences in rights and responsibilities between the two, between a lease and a license?
So one of the biggest things is exclusive possession.
Okay.
With a lease, you're given exclusive possession, meaning you can occupy the property and exclude others, even the owner.
Okay.
So like they can't just come barging in whenever they want.
That makes sense.
But with
Yeah.
the license, you don't have that same level of control.
Okay, so exclusive possession, that's a big one. What about like the agreements themselves? Do they need to be set up in a certain formal way for a lease or a license?
So for the most part, a lease requires a written agreement,
Okay.
and that has all the terms and conditions.
It's like the nitty-gritty.
Exactly how long it's going to last, how much the rent is going to be, uh, what each person's responsibilities are.
Yeah, that
Like a typical rental contract that you'd see for an apartment.
makes sense.
But licenses can be a bit more informal. Sometimes they're written down, but other times they can be implied
Okay.
or even just verbal.
So a lease is more like a formal contract.
Hmm.
A license can be a little bit looser.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, what about the interest in the property itself? Does that differ between a lease and a license?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
So with a lease, you actually gain a legal interest in the property.
Okay.
It's called a leasehold estate.
Yep.
And it gives you certain enforceable rights.
Okay.
But a license, on the other hand, that doesn't create any such interest.
It's just permission.
Exactly. It's not ownership, it's just permission.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So a lease is kind of like I have this temporary ownership, right? And a license is like I have permission to do something on the property.
Exactly.
What about like transferring these agreements? Can I sublet a rented apartment? Or can I like give my cricket ticket to a friend?
Yeah, that's a really key difference.
Okay.
So leases can be transferable, especially if they're for a long time.
Yeah.
So like you were saying, you might be able to sublet your apartment if your lease agreement allows it, or even sell the rest of your lease.
Interesting. Right.
But licenses usually aren't transferable.
Okay.
They're more like a personal permission given to a specific person.
So I can't sublet my right to go to a cricket match.
Right.
What about breaking these agreements? Is it easier to break a lease or a license?
Well, breaking a lease can get pretty tricky because it is a legally binding contract.
Right.
So there are conditions for how it can be ended early.
Yeah, you can't just, break it whenever you want.
Exactly. And if you break those conditions, then there could be legal consequences.
Oh, okay.
But licenses are a bit easier to revoke.
Okay.
Usually the person who gave the license has more flexibility to say,
Right.
actually, never mind, you can't do that anymore.
Okay. So leases are more difficult to break because it's a contract.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What happens if the property is sold? Does that change anything?
It definitely can. If a property is sold and it has a lease on it, the new owner is usually bound by that lease agreement.
So the lease stays in place?
Exactly. The lease basically runs with the land,
Interesting.
but with a license, the sale of the property can often terminate the license.
Oh, so it's not binding on the new owner?
Right. The new owner doesn't have to honor the old permissions.
So a lease offers a lot more protection if the property changes hands.
Exactly.
Okay, what other differences should we be aware of?
Let's talk about what happens when someone passes away.
Oh, okay, a little morbid, but important.
It is important. So with a lease, the agreement usually continues, even if one of the parties dies.
Okay.
The rights and obligations under that lease can be passed on.
Okay.
But with a license, it's a little different.
Okay.
Licenses are more like personal agreements, so when someone dies, they typically end.
Oh, so the lease is built to kind of last even beyond the original people involved.
Exactly.
Okay, and then what about property improvements?
Okay, so think about it this way. You're renting an apartment, and you decide to repaint or get some new light fixtures.
Yeah, spruce it up a little bit.
Right. Exactly. Now, as a lessee, you might actually be entitled to some benefit from those improvements,
Okay.
especially if they increase the value of the property.
I can maybe get lower rent or something when I move out.
It's possible, depending on your lease agreement and what kind of improvements they were.
Okay.
But with a license, you don't have that same entitlement.
Yeah.
You're not really entitled to any benefit
Yeah.
from any improvements you make because you don't have that ownership interest.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So we've covered a lot. Agreements, interest in the property transferability, whether you can break them, what happens if the property's sold, what happens if somebody dies, even improvements. I'm starting to see that these distinctions really do matter.
They do.
Yeah.
And all these general principles, they actually play out in real life all the time.
Oh, I bet. I bet.
Yeah, and actually, we can look at some specific cases to see how these differences have been interpreted by courts.
Okay, so case law, this is where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. We're going to see how this all plays out in the real world.
All right, I'm ready. Let's do it. Case law. Oh, this is going to be good.
It is. It's where it gets real.
Yeah. So let's start with a case that shows how important intention is. Like, how do we know if it's a lease or a license?
Right. Well, there's a case, CM Bina versus PN Ramchandra Rao,
Okay.
went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2004, and it's all about intention.
So how do courts figure out what people really meant if it's not written down clearly?
Well, they have to become detectives.
Okay.
They look at everything. The whole agreement, what everyone was doing, the words they used, the situation, everything.
So it's not just like what's on paper.
Right. It's the whole picture.
Okay, got it. So what's another case that shows how different leases and licenses really are?
Okay, how about this? Associated Hotels of India, LTD, VRN Kapoor. Supreme Court, 1960.
Okay, so this one's all about the legal nuts and bolts.
Yeah, this case made it clear that a lease gives you a real interest in the property.
Okay.
You have actual rights.
A license is different.
Okay.
It's just permission and it can be taken away. So it's more than just being able to use the property. It's like having a right to use it.
Exactly. And then there's Municipal Corporation of Delhi versus Pradeep Oil Corporation,
Okay.
Delhi High Court. And they said, a license doesn't give you ownership even if you use the property for a long time.
So even if you're there for ages, it's not the same as owning a piece of it.
Nope. Different thing altogether. Oh, and then there's Khalil Ahmad Bashir, Ahmad V. Tufel Hussain, Sanfai Sarang Purwala.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? Supreme Court, 1968, and this one said, even if it doesn't say lease, if you have the right to enjoy a property without anyone bothering you, it's basically a lease.
So even if it doesn't have the label.
Doesn't matter. They look at what it actually does.
Courts are sneaky.
They are, so you can't just rely on what it's called.
Okay, makes sense. Wow. So they really look at the whole situation to decide if it's a lease or a license.
D2. The details matter.
Makes sense. So we've covered a lot about intention and ownership and what happens when things change.
Mm-hmm. And how important those differences are.
I'm definitely feeling more knowledgeable.
Good. But before we finish up, I have one last question for our listeners.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. I'm ready. Hit me with it. All right, lay it on me. What's the big mystery?
Okay, so think about this. When do things get murky? When is it not so clear if it's a lease or a license?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's probably not always super obvious, is it?
No, not always. Like, what about family? If you let your brother stay in your house for a while, is that a lease?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Or let's say you let someone use your land for something really specific.
Okay.
Not a normal business deal. Then what is it?
Yeah, it's not so black and white, is it?
Nope. And those gray areas, that's where the trouble starts.
Oh, yeah. Because then nobody knows what's allowed and what's not.
Exactly. And then you end up in court fighting over it.
So what should people do? Hire a lawyer for every little thing.
Well, a lawyer is always a good idea,
Yeah.
especially for the complicated stuff.
Right.
But there are things you can do yourself to make things clear.
Okay, I like that approach. What are your top tips?
Okay, number one, get it in writing.
Write it down.
Yes. Even if it's not a fancy legal document, just having it written down helps a lot.
So you and the other person are on the same page?
Exactly.
Okay.
And be specific.
Okay.
What's it for? How long? Who does what?
Don't leave anything out.
Right. The more details, the better.
Okay, makes sense. And if you're still not sure,
Then get a lawyer.
better safe than sorry.
Exactly.
Well, after all this, I'm feeling a lot more confident about this whole lease versus license thing.
Good. I'm glad.
Definitely going to be checking my agreements more carefully now.
Yeah, good idea. It's all about knowing your rights.
That's right. So to everyone listening out there, leases and licenses, they're important.
They are. It's not just legal mumbo-jumbo. It's your life.
Yeah, so pay attention to this stuff and keep learning.
Yes, stay curious and stay informed.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into leases and licenses in India. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.